Got it. So welcome to Discipline 101 for a new semester. This is for those that might be new. This is an activity of Seacoast, the Collaboratory for Coastal Adaptation over Space and Time. It's a series of seminars where we all from a bunch of different disciplines try to teach each other about how our discipline views things, and maybe most specifically coastal things, but in general try to teach each other what the main perspectives and methods from our disciplinary lenses are. And the hope is that with enough of this, in the end, we'll all be able to, or at least some subsets of us will come up with new ways of viewing the coast that melds these lenses together and can forge some new kinds of science that aren't stuck in one discipline or the other. So let's see, I get to introduce today's talk, which I'm really looking forward to. But just before that, a little bit of mechanics. Let me remind us that the way we'll do the question and answer. So we'll have something like a 20-minute or so presentation today from Catherine Stevenson. And we would typically have a pair of 2 20-minute presentations with question and answer discussion in between or after each one. Casey Bush had a conflict come up at the last moment and will not be able to join. So with the time limitation won't be stringent, and we'll just enjoy discussion as long as it seems to go. And the way we'll do that, the question and answer part of that is if you could submit your questions in the chat, and you can either submit them for everyone. Great, 30-minute talk sounds wonderful. Or you can submit questions in the chat just to Catherine Enarde, who will moderate the question and discussion. She can either just read your question for you if you prefer, so send it directly to her in that case, or post it to everyone and she will call on people to ask their questions out loud after that. So,
Brad, can I just say quickly on mechanics? I think
yes.
Catherine had offered to present about a 30-minute talk in Casey's absence. So just to put that out there explicitly so that Catherine can know that that's on the radar. So Catherine, if you're still with that, I'm not sure if that memo made it all the way through, but I just wanted to put that out there so that you can relax knowing that we're not anticipating the 20-minute.
Okay, that's fine.
Yes, thank you. And I understand that Catherine's talk is at least somewhat a collaboration with Casey Bush, although won't represent everything Casey would have talked about by any means. But so Catherine has a really interesting sounding background that started with a BS in biology and a PhD in fisheries. Sounds siloed enough so far. And then got training certificates in conservation psychology and structured decision making. And she's a faculty member now at North Carolina State University in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management. So I'm really looking forward to this talk, and I'll turn it over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Brad. Thanks for having me, everyone. I'm happy to be here, and thanks for the introduction. So I guess to maybe connect a few more of the dots, like why is this person talking about education? So my BS was in biology, and my PhD was in fisheries, wildlife, and conservation biology. But I think along the way, a common thread through all of that has been a real passion for outreach and education. So when I was I did my BS at Davidson and worked in the herpetology lab there as an undergraduate researcher, and quickly found that I'd rather be in the classrooms with our animals than tracking them down in the field. I liked the field work too, but it was more fun for me to be in the classroom. And then after that, spent 2 years doing residential outdoor ed, and then spent about 6 years in the high school classroom teaching science. And then when I came back to do my PhD, I worked with Nils Peterson, who's a human intervention scholar. And so he kind of brought his social science perspective, and I brought my education background, and then we turned it into an environmental ed dissertation. And so that sort of started me off, and then I was just hooked, and I was lucky enough to get to stay on as a postdoc and a faculty member now. So I'm still kind of taking along that thread. I focus on education, and as hopefully I will kind of convince you today, I think it has a real opportunity to contribute meaningfully to our kind of our grand challenges. So it's beyond broader impacts, as our title would suggest. And I'm going to start sharing my screen, and if you'll just bear with me while I like get all the Zoom windows just how I want them. And if someone will unmute if you feel like I'm going awry, please let me know. Just a second. I had those all, so this is how it always goes, right? You always set up in the practice and then it never quite goes back to the way you wanted it. Okay.
Looks good.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's see. So again, I'm Catherine. Unfortunately, Casey, as you know, is not here. I'll sort of point as we go through some of the places where her work really intersects well with mine. And hopefully I'll give you enough of a teaser that you'll go back and learn more about what she's doing, because she's doing really exciting stuff. I think is really gonna, I think a lot of her particularly theoretical work is really gonna push the field forward in understanding how we can really contribute as educators. And supporting education and supporting kids and just learners in general, from all the way through adults, to how we can meaningfully engage in community learning to support environmental solutions. I also just want to, from the get-go, kind of acknowledge this amazing team of people that continue to work with us. I'm going to nod to a few of them specifically as we go through, but here are some of the names, in addition to the incredible teachers that we work with and community partners. So many thanks to them. Okay, so I'm going to start off sort of making a pitch for why I think kids are interesting and why I think they're important. So many times I work in schools specifically. We do work with informal learning institutions too, or community programs, but a lot of times I do work in schools, and there's a couple reasons for that. One is that's where all the kids are. So the first two things are what we would think of as why we might work with kids. So early intervention does seem to matter. So if we're able to sort of get into schools or into kid serving institutions and talk about the environment, it does seem to set them sort of on a trajectory of long-term interest, right? And that's, I think, a lot what people think of is usually one of the main points of education, especially education outreach. We work with kids so that we're creating kind of future stewards, and that's all well and good, and a big reason why I think that's a good thing. Also, I work in schools because, again, that's where all the kids are. And what I mean by that is that there's really not a lot of other institutions where you have the potential for such a big reach and also diverse reach, because in general, everybody goes to school. So when we work with other institutions, even like after school clubs, they're wonderful, but often it's a level of privilege that kids are able to attend those after school clubs. So I like to work with schools because we can get everybody. And then these last two bullets are the ones that I'm going to focus on today. And this is really where I see sort of the potential to go sort of beyond what we think of as usual education efforts, which is typically kind of more akin to like outreach models as opposed to like co-production. So instead of us thinking only as sort of a one-way thing, like we share our science with the next generation, we can begin to think of education as a two-way process, where kids learn from us, yes, but we also learn from kids and understand how kids can uniquely contribute to their communities. So I'm going to go through a few of kind of like walk you through some of the research that sort of developed this thinking and hopefully bring you to where we are now. So these two graphs, I'm going to just sort of leave them up here so you can absorb them for a minute. This was a big part of my dissertation work. And so this, in the context of climate change, I did my dissertation around I guess I did this particular bit around 2013. And that's about when social science research around climate change perceptions was really taking off. It's not like it hadn't been done before, but it was just a very, very prolific time. And essentially the story was and still is that climate change perceptions are really based off of things like politics and worldviews rather than science, right? So it's not going to work to just hand people a graph and say, look, it's bad, get on board. That's just not how people work. And so there was this figure on the left was from a paper from Dan Kahan and his group, and they looked at the effects of worldview and science literacy and numeracy. So essentially what this would suggest is that people who are good at science and good at numbers, instead of kind of coming together is in consensus on climate change, they just get more polarized. So people who are smart people are really good at using data to reinforce their ideologically formed views. So that's not shocking. And I think we continue to learn that lesson. We're still in that mode right now. But it can be a little depressing when we think of it in terms of communication or education. You're like, okay, well, how do we break through this stuff? And so when I was doing this as a doc student, I was thinking, I don't know that kids really are coming at that in the same way. And so we ran a pretty parallel study. It wasn't exact, but we used some similar measures and we looked at climate specific knowledge. So we said, okay, kids who know about climate change, do they present the same kinds of polarization as adults, and how does that interact? And essentially we found kind of the opposite trend with kids than we did adults. So first of all, kids were polarized in similar ways to adults. And that's maybe not shocking. Kids live in the world, they talk to their parents, they understand what's going on. But as they learn more about climate change, instead of becoming more polarized, they came together, which tends to suggest to us that maybe these ideological filters and worldviews that really drive adults' perceptions of climate change, it would be logical that kids are still developing those, so maybe they aren't quite as powerful. So this is like potentially a really hopeful message, right? Kids may see climate change and be able to engage in it in a way that adults really just can't, or it's really difficult to get them to. So kind of after that, the next step was like, okay, well then what can we do with this? So if kids really think about climate change differently, can we use that perspective to help adults sort of enter the conversation a little bit differently too? And so then this was my first doc student, Danielle Lawson, who's now at Penn State and still doing this type of work. She's doing really incredible stuff. And essentially what we did with her project is we looked at this concept of intergenerational learning. So this is much bigger than environmental ed. It's studied in all kinds of contexts, and you can think of it as bidirectional. So some people are more interested in learning from adults to kids. We are particularly interested in kids to adults. So when you have generations talking about an issue, how does that learning work? And particularly, how do adults receive messages from kids? And so this has been, that particular aspect of intergenerational learning is also not unique to environmental challenges. It's been studied all over the place. So marketing is like an everyday example. So any kinds of toys or food that's marketed to kids are not doing the purchasing. You're marketing to kids so that kids bug their parents to buy stuff, right? So that's like a very simple example. Well, the same thing could be said on more complex social phenomenon than kids cereal. Views on sexual orientation, there's a lot of work around that says that kids' views were able to are kind of responsible for the shifts in sort of public perception and acceptance of gender diversity and sexual orientation diversity. And then there are like studies that are specific to environment. So things on plant and animal conservation, recycling, that was a huge one. I was a child coming up in the 80s and 90s when the recycling campaigns were really taking off, and mostly they credit those to campaigns through schools. Kids learned how to recycle and then bugged their parents about it. So it's happened before. And then this particular study, we're interested in whether it could happen in a context of climate change. And again, this was also in this was like 2014 14, 15, 16. So that was an interesting moment in North Carolina. Like, I mean, it continues to be when we think about climate change conversations and the political context of climate change. Around then was just like it was pretty hot button topic. It's when we had these big reports coming out and we were making national net headlines that North Carolina's outlying sea level rise. All of that was happening. So we were interested to see what was happening or what would happen. So with this project, we did an intervention with teachers. So we did like a treatment control pre-post design. We had a couple batches of teachers and randomly assigned them to treatment group and a control group. The control group just kept doing their thing, but helped us out with surveys, which was really nice. And the treatment group, we trained in this curriculum. And so this is one that we had developed over the years with lots of partnerships, but essentially, it was based off of Project Wild, which is a great environmental ed curricula. And it was consistent with literature that we were finding, which is like, how, you know, what primes intergenerational learning, and essentially with kids to parents. And essentially it was like, well, you need really good at education, right? So, and that's things like using local issues, using longer and in-depth lessons, doing things that are hands-on, having teachers that are really engaged. That's just good education. But then also layering on encouraging parent participation. So essentially we just like made what we saw as like a really good way for kids to engage with climate change and then encourage them to go home and share what they learned with their parents. And so we didn't really interact with the parents, or we didn't at all. We trained teachers, teachers taught kids, kids went home and talked to parents. And then, so we got the results back from this one. We were really excited about this. So this is, again, treatment control design. These are standardized beta coefficients. If you want me to get into the stats, I'm happy to. But essentially the take home is that it worked. So the treatment group, we saw an increase in climate change concern among kids, but also their parents. And it was a mediated relationship. So it's, 3 kids, 2 parents, just as we would expect. But then also even more interesting we found was that this was particularly true among conservative parents. So that impact seemed to be more so among conservative parents and among dads, and also when daughters were doing the talking. So when we saw these results, we were like, wow, we got something good here. Because this is, if you're familiar with the research around climate change communication, conservative men, those are 2 demographics that are like the hardest to change their minds. If they're skeptical against climate change, they're more likely to be skeptical, and it's really hard to kind of overcome that among these 2 demographic groups. So the fact that there's more of an impact is a pretty big deal. And then the fact that it's coming from daughters, that's also just kind of an interesting, different take on what we usually think of when you think of especially young girls in science and engaging them and kind of the power they have in that space. It seems in this space, they seem to be really impactful. So with that, we're kind of where we are now is kids think differently about climate change. They're able to influence their parents in these like kind of exciting ways. And so the next step for that is to see kind of how far that influence might be able to travel. And so these are a couple of more students that have been helping along with that. Jenna Hartley is about to, well, she's finished, she's defended, she will graduate as soon as I guess this May. And then Lauren Gibson, who's a current student, and she's in her 3rd year now. And they are doing really amazing stuff. So again, we're going from kids to parents to now communities. So this was Jenna's project on marine debris. And so we did a little bit of a turn. We weren't focusing just on climate change. We were kind of exploring different coastal issues. For various reasons I could get into if you'd like. You want more like the story behind our decisions. But one of the exciting things about this project is we started working more intentionally with Liz DiMattia down at Duke Marine Lab. And I cannot say enough wonderful things about her. She's doing incredible work in terms of community science and in community engagement down in Beaufort. And she had put together this marine debris curriculum. And when I met her and was talking to her about it, it was like, this is exactly what we're trying to do. What if we team up, you run your curriculum and we'll come study the impacts. And so since that project, we've been working together kind of in that mode. So this particular curriculum, similar to the thing that I was talking about with climate change, is sort of hitting all those like literature-backed methods for good environmental ed and particularly good intergenerational learning processes. So it's hands-on, it's a year-long curriculum. The teachers are really engaged, we really support them, so they feel supported and stay really excited about it. The thing that we layered on to this one, we also have them go home and talk with their parents about what they're learning, but we also guided the teachers and kids through making public service announcements. So some of them made videos. We can watch them if you're interested, if we have extra time. They're really cute. And they also did some community engagement events. And these are kid-led to varying degrees, as you might imagine. Some teachers really let the kids run with it, and some of them held onto those reins pretty tightly. But they did beach cleanups, but they also did like public art projects. They did trash fashion shows. They did poetry slams. One group had convinced a local brewery to make this nautical IPA, and they had this big beer release event, and they invited the mayor, and the kids presented about marine debris. It was really cute. And so we just had them out in their community to talk about marine debris. And then we kind of came behind them and surveyed along. And so we were interested in similar questions like, okay, so does this make an impact among adults? And how are those dynamics working when we think of things like political ideology, which, as we know, maybe not quite as strong as with climate change, but sort of colors everything, everything that we do, is, I mean, certainly including the environment. So what we found were pretty similar trends. So let me kind of walk you through this a little bit. So this was, this just focuses on the community adults. And so we have the pink bars are local officials. So something else we layered onto here is we did some targeted outreach to the local officials, particularly in the communities where we're working. But when we had the video PSAs, really just hit statewide, like, hey, look at what kids are learning about marine debris. And then voters is what we termed just sort of like non-officials, the adults in the communities. And so what we see here is that after watching these PSAs or engaging with the kids at these community engagement events, we see marine debris concern significantly jump for both groups, and support for local ordinances to address marine debris also increase. You'll kind of notice that the officials, well, it's hard to kind of see here, but the officials were actually, you know what, I have to double check on this. This may be swapped. I think the key may be swapped. Essentially, the officials didn't have as big of an effect, which kind of makes sense, right? They're the ones actually making policy and kind of understand all the nuances of like, okay, like you say you want a law, this is what it all means. But the take home is that the support grew in both groups, which is exciting. And the other thing that we thought was exciting is that the political polarization decreased. So going into it, we had the blue bars are people identifying as liberal. The red bars are people identifying as conservative, and they're splitting in kind of predicted ways. So coming into it, the pre-scores, their marine debris concerns are polarized. And then afterwards, we've got pretty much the same. I'm not sure that I think there was still a little bit of a significant difference. It's not quite the same, but we're approaching like consensus essentially. And if nothing else, definitely the polarization is going down. And similar even for support for ordinances, which is also kind of surprising, right? When we think of how political parties tend to, approach regulations and that kind of thing. So the patterns are predictable, but the decrease in polarization is exciting and something we don't see very often in any context. So we think this is really cool. And so the next steps, what we're thinking of doing is still working in communities, but this is where Casey's stuff starts to really layer on. So far, our stuff has been like pretty interventionist and applied, and I think finding really, really wonderful things, but Casey and that collaboration has been really wonderful to like put some more theoretical chops behind it and really think about what's possible. So we're interested in this idea of community level environmental literacy. And I'll try to do some of her reasoning justice, but you should chat with Casey more about this because she's been thinking about it for a long time. But we have these collective problems, collective environmental problems, and they arguably need collective action. So I've been talking and thinking about this for with many, many people in the environmental ed world. Like the environmental ed kind of grew out of the environmental movement and the environmentalist movement. And that is closely tied to civic action and community action. And a lot of the founding documents talk about community action. But the practice and the theory that we have behind it really has grown out of science education and more traditional education fields that really that are not think about your high school science classroom. They may encourage you to do action, but it's not a classroom where they teach you how local government works and how you might do action at scale.
Could you say that again?
Sorry, my watch is talking to me. So she has something to say about this too. So when you think about if you're coming from a science ed background or a science classroom, as I was, I could encourage my kids to do actions, but if we don't have the support for them, what they end up walking away with is recycling and turning off the lights and saving water. And that's all well and good. That's great, but that's not going to cut it as far as addressing these big challenges. And so when we think about education, we kind of have to think about how do we think about environmental literacy sort of at a community level? How do we think about action at scale, at a community scale? And so one of the things we're thinking about is when we think about environmental literacy, which would be similar to scientific literacy, it's essentially having the knowledge and skills and motivations to act. Typically, we think about it at the individual level, but that's really not really what we need. We need something at the community level. We need communities to be environmentally literate. So it's not so much an aggregate measure. It's not, we need everybody in this community to understand climate change and exactly what to do. It's together as a whole community. We need experts in climate science. We need experts in government and policy. We need experts in all of these different things. And so then it becomes a measure of how is knowledge distributed? How does that knowledge flow through a community? Who's included in that community knowledge knowledge distribution? And also, how is it situated? How is the knowledge contextual to the place? So people in coastal North Carolina are going to think about sea level rise probably differently than people in Raleigh, just because the way that we interact with our environment, right? So all of these things sort of swirling around, we're trying to figure out what this means to our work when we're working through schools. And so what we're interested in is how schools might serve as hubs for community level environmental literacy. Meaning, so kind of back to the first slide, thinking I work in schools because that's where all the kids are. Schools are really one of the only institutions we have left, really, that we have really diverse sectors of the community coming together every day. And that's through the kids. But if you have that structure, you also potentially have access to bringing families together from diverse sectors of the community. And so if you're able to do that, you might have an opportunity to use classrooms and schools as a hub to sort of disseminate out information and have conversations that hopefully start to include diverse viewpoints and also work towards more shared goals and shared understandings and shared kind of action strategies to address these collective problems. And so for instance, this might be what we would see. So we might hypothesize in the beginning of a school year, we might see something like this, where the teacher's sort of talking with students are talking to a few parents, and they might talk about water quality or marine debris or climate change like this. But then after a school year where we intentionally kind of encourage people to interact with one another, we might see something more like this. So we're hoping to use schools as a way to increase the network of communication around environmental challenges. And then ultimately, what we're looking to do is support something like this. And I don't know how well this is showing up on your screen, so apologies if it is too small. That essentially what we're thinking is we think of like something like coastal resilience, and we think of like a broader umbrella of all kinds of things, we might come up with, again, support teachers and other education institutions in delivering locally relevant resiliency curriculum. And then through that, kids are engaged. And then when kids are engaged, and particularly engaged in action in their communities, that gives us a way to engage parents and other community members and the adults to learn about these issues together. And if we're using schools as a way to do it, hopefully that's a mechanism to bring diverse sectors of the community together. If we're doing that, then we have a situation where we have broad education across the community. And then if we're involving policymakers, it creates a mechanism and an opportunity for policymakers then to hear from their communities and facilitate a more co-productive way to learn about what issues are important, what do we need to answer those questions, what policies do we need to support them, and essentially have people working together a little bit more efficiently to kind of create and implement solutions that they want, right? So to define the future that they want and figure out a way to get there together. And it is like, it sounds really utopistic, but it's something we're really excited about. And I think the more we get into this, we're interested in sort of the building blocks of each one of these links. We're kind of that's what the research is like, what's going to facilitate these links, but this is sort of the big picture of what we're kind of aiming for. And so we're excited, and hopefully we'll get funding to do it through our COPE and other mechanisms. So let's see, I think I did it. I think I'm doing okay on time, and I would love to get some questions, and we'll just leave these, I'll leave you with, this is my contact information. You're welcome to get in touch, and then just some adorable children doing their thing.
Thanks, Catherine.
Sure.
That was great. Great timing too.
Good.
So I don't see any questions in the chat, but I know that Marty has some questions ready to go. So Marty, if you want to go ahead.
I'll just start with one, and then if there's time later, I'll ask another one. So I want to just say what an amazing talk. I think the experiments that you shared are really provocative and fascinating. And I love the way you put it in context, both in education, but also in sort of broader environmental movement. Just wonderful stuff. So one of the things that I really am perplexed by, especially in the way you sort of shared some of the youth driver of transformations and opinions on sexual orientation, is that climate change has become more polarized in aggregate, right? And so I'm trying to reconcile this sort of result that you have on kids learning more about climate change being less polarized, and the temporal dynamics of the issue in society at large becoming more polarized, with the fact that more of those kids are rolling into the adult population and just in general are more educated about climate change than they used to be. And so I know that's a very hard question, but I'm just curious what you think about it.
It is. I think that if I'm understanding it correctly, I think it is complex, right? So I think that part of the reason I do this work too is because I find it's like in the midst of all of this craziness, it's like a little glimmers of hope, right? And I hope it's not just delusional. I don't think it is, but because I would also point to, I mean, it's not surprising to me that we're more polarized on climate change just because we're more polarized in everything right now. I mean, it's just insane. These last 2 years have been so crazy on so many levels, right? And I would hedge that that's a lot of it, right? Like it's just sort of wrapped up in this increasing like fever pitch of polarization. But I think that, I guess a couple of responses is, I'm not sure if I have a good explanation on why that is, right? But a couple of things that it makes me think about that we discuss in our lab is that we are really excited about understanding and supporting sort of community level conversations, right? So I think youth activism is incredibly, inspiring, right? Like I'm all for Greta, that is wonderful, right? But that's not exactly what we're doing. And I think that both have a place. I think what we're more interested in is driving those conversations kind of where kids are at dinner tables and in their communities. Because I think that is a different level. It's a lot easier for people to look at Greta on TV and be dismissive, right? It's a lot harder to do that with kids that you know that are in your Girl Scout troops and your church groups and on your kids' soccer team. So I think it's more relational. And I think that is ultimately what is hopefully going to help polarization in general, right? Is relationships. And I think with kids, if people know kids, that makes a big difference. And even if they don't know them, but they can envision them and draw direct, like, well, that does look like my kid, right? That's a really different mechanism, and not one that I think we're tapping into as much as we could. So I hope that
Thanks. That was just a wonderful answer. And I just want to take the opportunity to mention in the language that we've seen in this seminar series before, talking about causal inference. I mean, in some sense, what you just told us is the counterfactual would have been more polarization. And so this is cutting against like a dramatic upward trend in society at large. And so I really appreciate that answer, and it makes a lot of sense to me.
All right, good.
All right, let's move on to the next question. Jorge, I saw you raise your hand, and then we'll move on to Rick.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Catherine, for your talk. It was very interesting, all the work that you're doing. My question is, what are your thoughts or what you've seen in terms of the environmental literacy curriculum development for underrepresented or minoritized communities? If there is something different or what you have observed there.
That's a good question. I think that is, like the rest of the world, something that environmental education is really trying to give due and much overdue attention to. I don't know if I have, so I live more in the research side than the programming side, so I don't think I can give you an exhaustive list. However, there are, I guess the things that come to mind are pretty like a really rapid growth of organizations like Afro Outdoors has been around for a long time, Latino Outdoors, Justice Outside. Most of those organizations are more, I guess, instead of the stuff that we're talking about that's related. It's more about seeing kind of nature and outdoor spaces as a basic human right, and kind of acknowledging that those spaces have predominantly been white and exclusionary. And so trying to figure out and how to make those spaces more inclusive and also more inviting, and kind of change a narrative so that when we think of the outdoors, we don't think of a white guy on an REI ad. And REI, in places like REI have been really instrumental in trying to kind of like flip that narrative intentionally. So I guess to answer I don't know if that totally answers your question. I guess I'm encouraged to see all the programs really developing and gaining a lot of traction. I'm encouraged to hear and see the what I view as like really genuine effort in the EE community to kind of sit up and pay attention, learn, do the work, figure it out. I think we have a long way to go, but I'm hoping that, I guess, in relation to this work, where I see connections and what we're trying to lean into is similar to what I was relating to before, is just relationship building and kind of looking around and saying, who's here, who's not here, who do we need to talk to, who do we need to bring into the conversation, who are most impacted by environmental hazards, what do they need, how can we kind of what power structures are at play in a community, how can we sort of flip those, right? And that's part of what we're trying to do with kids, right? But how do we kind of take that theme and make it so that we're creating kind of an equitable conversation in decision making? That was a little rambly, but I hope that sort of got to what some of your questions.
It did. Thank you very much. I appreciate your answer.
Okay, Rick, go ahead with your question.
Hey, thank you. Catherine, this was great. Thank you very much. I have, my organization, Carolina Wetlands Association, has been working with communities recently that are being flooded. And we're working with them to use their wetland or nature resources to help mitigate some of that flooding. And we do have a funded project that's just starting up right now to do that very thing. But one of the components that we are going to be is, of course, it's community engagement. And some of the communities are vulnerable communities, but not all of them. But nevertheless, I'm looking at what you're doing and thinking that if we don't include like a school field trip to what we're doing, we might not be as successful in getting the community to understand and buy in what we're trying to do to help them. I see something really interesting here. I just would like your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so I was just Googling you as you were talking, trying to like quickly learn about what you were trying to do. So I guess tell me more about what you are doing with education and outreach.
Well, not that much right now. I mean, we do some as an organization. Clearly, we try to get people out into wetlands. We do wetland tours and try to teach them the value of wetlands and things like that. But this effort of actually trying to work with communities to use their nature-based solutions to help mitigate flooding issues is a new effort. Okay, so and we've got about 4 different projects we're working on, but we've gotten one funded now, and we're thinking soon we'll get a couple others funded. But we haven't engaged the community yet. We've engaged some of the local officials. In one case, they were, I think, pretty receptive to what we were trying to do. In another case, they were very suspicious of what we were trying to do. And yet we do have community champions in each of these places. So it's not like, we went there because of the community was inviting us to help out with their issues. So we were planning to do community engagement with, the adults and with the elected officials, but we weren't considering doing like inviting a school to have a field trip and to learn more about what we're doing. And I'm thinking maybe we should, and maybe that would help us, influence what's going on, especially if we're having maybe some resistance is maybe not the right word, but some, rather than excitement about what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I'm convinced of that strategy.
Oh.
But I think also something I would say that I think sometimes another reason or maybe we have not done, we're still trying to figure out how to dig into more of the why and what's the mechanism going on here. But my hunch is that when you see kids in a landscape, it's a little easier to kind of activate what the conservation is for, right? And I think that's maybe really compelling, right? I don't know, my family has a long history with the land trust, and I was goading the executive director. I'm like, there are no people in these photos. Like, how are people going to see themselves? And you need kids in these photos so that they can kind of see what they're trying to give money to save it for, right? So I think that may help. The other thing I would just mention is that one thing that we're lucky in North Carolina is we have an incredibly robust network of environmental educators. So I think working with schools is great. But you do not have to do that alone. And there, actually, I'm going to put, if you guys don't already know, I'm going to put this as a plug, is the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education and Public Affairs. They have a whole mapped network of environmental ed centers that I was trying to decide, where are y'all statewide, or where are you mostly located?
Yeah, we're statewide. In fact, we're in South Carolina too. In fact, we are actually working a little bit with Lauren Daniel, as a matter of fact.
Oh, okay, great.
So,
I was going to actually.
Yeah. So yeah, she's fantastic. There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
Her,
yeah.
But I think Lauren is a great place to start then. I think she's a good gateway to all these things. But I think there are plenty of people that would be happy to partner with you and offer curriculum. The world does not need that much more curriculum. We have a lot of curriculum.
Okay. So. I got you on that one. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Laura, I see your hand is raised. You want to go ahead?
Catherine, that was great. Thank you for the presentation. I'm so excited about the work that you're doing and the work that you and Casey are doing together. And I hope we get funded so you can do even more work with Seacoast. I just wanted to put a point on, I love your title, Beyond Broader Impacts, and just something I've noticed as I've worked more and more closely with you and Casey in the preparation of the proposal over the last couple of years is how misunderstood the work that you both do can be by other parts of the research community, because, you know, we're so, I don't know, scientists, for example, and social scientists were drilled with NSF proposals, for example, you've got to include broader impacts. And so K through 12 and even informal education can often be sort of relegated to the thing that you add in because you really want your work to be carried beyond. And so, you know, it's with good faith and we're excited to do that. But I just, you know, how do you communicate to other researchers about the fact that what you're doing is research? And so, yeah, in some ways there are people who do what you do as broader impacts, but what you're doing is the fundable science in and of itself. So how do you sort of bring that message forward? I mean, I think that this talk is part of doing that, but are there other ways, and how do you, I mean, you probably run up against this over and over, and I'm just curious how you, and what can we as researchers who now better understand what you do, how can we be part of kind of carrying that message forward about this as a research area that is so important and vibrant in and of itself?
Yeah, that's a good question, Laura, and I appreciate it. I don't know if I have, like, if it's been a strategic, you know, method for doing that, but I think you're hitting on, I think it's like all of the above, right? So I think when I first got hired on, I was warned and kind of knew this would be the case, that they're like, oh, you're going to have a lot of collaboration requests because people are just want you to do broader impacts, right? So I'm glad people kind of early on were kind of mentoring me to give me sort of permission to say no to those things. So, I mean, I think some of it is just those conversations. It's just like, that's wonderful. That's not what I do, you know, like so there's, and also knowing some resources of people, like pointing them to like the Friday Institute, who does really wonderful research too, but that's sort of their bread and butter, is that's their job, is to help with broader impacts and sort of just one-on-one conversations, that level of education. I think you're right, just doing presentations like this, that's one level. And then it's essentially talking to anybody who will listen to me about it, and other people that do these things, you know, like when I was recently, I guess when I'm able to be in conversations with like the Frank Neopold, who's the education person for the climate office at NOAA, right? Just trying to grab people's ears and just be like, no, like we need to do better, that like this needs to be its own thing. Like, can you please quit treating education funding as this tack on, right?
Like its own program.
And we need,
yeah,
we need research grants, like, right? Like, and actually I was talking to him specifically about like the NOAA environmental literacy plan, or environmental literacy grants, which I'm applying for one now. It's good money as far as in an education realm, like it's a $500,000 grant. That's huge for this. And that's cool, but it's explicitly not a research grant, which is frustrating because we also want to do research on it, right? So then we have to like go behind the scenes. So I think it's just continually having those conversations with basically any level of folks who will listen, right? And I think I've been able to find really great collaborators who do get it, right? And that also helps, right? Because when you have collaborators and you have resources, you can produce impactful research, right? And then people are like, oh, we want more of that. Well, me too. It'd be great if you could fund it.
Thanks, Catherine. Great.
Sure.
Brad, go for it.
Well, I just wanted to get your take on something, and maybe this comes up regularly for you. On the one hand, it's clear that what you're doing is researching the most effective ways to educate everyone about societally really important topics. and everyone's clearly for that. From a different perspective, it could also potentially look like trying to find the most effective ways to accomplish environmentalist activism, and
Mhm.
just kind of a devil's advocate prod with NSF context in mind. How do you think about that, or how do you think about that?
That is a really great question. And yes, we think about that. And I get this is, you're not the first person to ask these questions of me or my students at their defenses, right? Because I mean, I think this is another example where we have to be cognizant and transparent about our own biases as researchers. Because yes, I mean, at some level, like on a personal level, I want kids to be excited about climate change and change hearts and minds in ways that will contribute to solutions, and probably the solutions that I want, if I'm honest about it, right? So I think that knowing that and trying to kind of continually check that, because I think at the core of what I think most people could get on board with is essentially this: decisions is all about, it's an expression of values, right? And so when you enter kids into the conversation, I think a way to think about that is to create a space where people can kind of examine the network of values they have and pick solutions that are consistent with those. Let me be a little more specific. So I think in general, a universal value is wanting good things for our kids, right? So, and you know, we is all of, you know, whether you're a parent or not, right? We want good things for future generations. And so I think when kids are leading conversations, logically, it activates those values, right? And so it helps you sort of maybe put in context these other value sets, right? Whether they're more politically affiliated, you know, whether you value, you know, individual liberties versus communitarian values, you know, that those are all in play, and sometimes can, and I think that drives our polarization, but it's just about getting people in the same room to understand where they may have common values so that we can kind of, they can together come up with solutions that reflect those. So that's sort of like the guiding principle that I try to like steer us toward, and also recognize along the way, like, this is not about pushing your own viewpoints, right? And being really intentional about how we design curriculum and how we run teacher workshops and those kinds of things to kind of continually keep that in check, because we do get that critique. And honestly, I think it's fair sometimes. And I think it's a continual reminder for us to realize that no science is value neutral, right? And so we want to make sure we're not trying to push our own viewpoints on people.
Didn't mean it as a critique, just the tension.
Oh, no, not at all. I didn't take it as such. But yeah, I think it's an excellent point.
Thank you. That helps.
All right, last question, Erin. Oh wait, you got to unmute yourself. I do that all the time.
And my mouse isn't working well today. So I apologize for the delay. Catherine, this is just sort of a follow-up to Brad's comment. I'm just curious about how much you have conversations, yet science isn't value neutral, but I mean, the work that you're doing is promoting science literacy, right? And so it's not really promoting environmental activism, it's engaging in the environment with science and trying to alter future behaviors that way, rather than it being something where you're promoting activism. And I'm wondering if you've communicated that and what kind of reaction you've had with that kind of an approach.
Yeah, I think we have. I would say we use that kind of framing, and it's not, and I guess when I use framing, it's not like spin, it's different, you know, it's like just like emphasizing different things for different audiences. And I think we use that type of framing when we talk to, particularly to districts and teachers, particularly when we were thinking about the climate change curriculum and trying to get that into schools. There were a lot of conversations about that, right? So it's like you know, we'd hand over our lessons and be like, this is just the science. We're just like, we just want to expose them to this. And by and large, I'd say, you know, trust, it's difficult, right? Because even that something seems neutral to us is like trust in science or belief in science, but even that is not like super neutral anymore. Or like, for instance, like teaching civics is a high school class, right? So civic activism in some way should be like, at least I would be like, in one way that seems like it would be neutral, right? It's just like getting people to vote, right? We're not telling how to vote or how to think. We just want them to do it, right? And so, yes, I think I guess to answer your question, yes, we think about that. We try to use those frames, and I mean, and they're genuine, right? We're not trying to teach people what to think. We're trying to encourage them to think or how to act, but encourage them to act. But increasingly, it's just, even those conversations are sometimes difficult to have in sort of the current climate of like, why are you talking about voting with my children? Like, well, because we're in a democracy. But yeah, I don't know if that kind of answers your question.
Yes, thanks.
All right, well, thanks everyone for attending today. Just a plug here, 2 weeks from today, same time, Elizabeth Frankenberg will be giving a seminar on household surveys as a tool for studying resilience. And Scott Hemmerling with the Water Institute of the Gulf will be talking about participatory modeling. And his talk title is Elevating Local Knowledge Through Participatory Modeling, Active Community Engagement and Restoration Planning. So we hope to see you here in 2 weeks. And thanks again, Catherine. That was phenomenal.
Thank you for having me.
Thank
Everyone.
you.